Welcome this afternoon on Monday to Humint. I'm here with Jeff Rogg. He is an intelligence historian, and he is also a senior research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute. He was previously an assistant professor at the Joint Special Operations University. And we're going to be talking about moments leading up to this moment, the 7 alleged drug boats that have now been struck by the United States. Trump has come out and said that he authorized the CIA to conduct covert action in Venezuela. Quote, I authorized this for 2 reasons, really. Number one, they've emptied their prisons into the United States of America, and we have a lot of drugs coming in from Venezuela. But we don't have a lot of details around any of these strikes. So let's start in the past. Jeff, take us back to the days of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, and let us know, were they engaged in targeted killings back then?
Sure. Hi, Sasha. Great to be with you. Hi, everyone. The OSS wasn't really designed to be an assassination organization, a targeted killing organization. However, it certainly engaged in sabotage and special operations. Think more along the lines of special operations today in terms of raids, on an enemy compound, capture, kill. Not exactly. It was more like sabotage against German troops and logistics sites. So what you're talking about today is something that's really on a different order of, um, I guess, the ladder of covert action. There's something called the ladder of covert action, and targeted killing or assassination kind of climbs towards the tops of that.
So why don't we talk about when the CIA first began lethal targeting?
Well, that's one of, I guess, the debates that historians have is, did the CIA really begin lethal targeting? Now, there's 3 cases that really stand out. Later, so we're moving ahead from the OSS to the early CIA. And it engaged, a lot of your viewers probably know about some of the coups in Guatemala or Iran in the 1950s. And then when the CIA's misdoings were investigated by the Church Committee in the 1970s, they did a special report or investigation into plans to do targeted killing, not actually assassinations themselves. And so, 3 examples. One's very well known, Fidel Castro in Cuba. 2 others lesser known, but at the time no less important, were Patrice Lumumba in Congo and Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic.
So
Now
let's
we
talk
know.
about
Yep.
each of these before
Mhm.
we move on, because I want to get everybody caught up with where we are. We're talking about a moment in the 1970s when Frank Church, the Democrat senator of, I believe it was Idaho, am I right? He wanted to uncover what the CIA was working on. It led to a lot of programs being exposed and a lot of these assassination plots. And it was, I mean, I wish I had been alive to see some of this, frankly. But why don't we start with Fidel Castro? The plots that I have learned about include spraying a TV screen with LSD, um, maybe giving him a poisoned cigar. Um, Tell me more about what you know of those attempts.
Yeah, it's kind of like out of, I guess, Wile E. Coyote trying to get the Roadrunner, exploding cigars, a poison that would make him lose his beard, because the idea was that his beard was his force of personality. As someone who has a beard, I can understand that. It's part of my personality too. So the idea
I
was he
don't
would,
have a personality because I don't have a beard, but go on.
well, or at least it goes with the personality. So, could you imagine Fidel Castro without a cigar and a beard, for example? But, this was part of the Kennedy administration's policy, which was to destabilize and remove a dictator and a client of the Soviet Union in our hemisphere. That's something that even today we shouldn't necessarily lose sight of, which is, the US tends to have a very protective attitude towards what goes on in the Western Hemisphere. And so the idea was to remove Castro from power. And, before that, the viewers might be familiar with the Bay of Pigs. That was something more along the lines of, I guess, what we'd say the OSS would do. It was a special operation to invade Cuba using Cuban exiles who were trained by the CIA and military special operations, and it failed. And so, what do you do next if something like more conventional like that fails? Well, try and kill the person. And
So,
so we never actually did it.
so why was Fidel Castro never handed that cigar or any of the other thoughts of ways to take his life?
Well, there's a bad precedent to set with killing a foreign leader in particular. That's something that, we should remember. I mentioned the three figures. They were all leaders in a foreign country. Um, Generally, and think about it, if you're the president of the United States, sure, you always have a target on your back too. But when you commit to it in a way and use the resources at your disposal, like the CIA, now you're kind of setting up a future in which really capable intelligence services, and some not as capable as others, sort of have, I guess, the precedent to go after foreign leaders. So there's also a risk averseness too, about this. After the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was he actually threatened to, I guess, shatter the CIA and cast it off into 1,000 pieces. There's some quote about that. So there was a certain risk averseness to getting rid of Castro after Bay of Pigs in Cuba.
Okay, so let's go back in time a little bit because we're just kind of this is a spontaneous conversation, as everybody knows. Let's talk about Patrice Lumumba. He had been elected in the Congo, the first democratically elected leader after Belgian forces moved out. There was a mutiny. Then the UN was brought in to try to quell it. Lumumba tries to get the US to help. The US doesn't want to help. Then he goes to the Soviets. Then the US says, oh, he's close to the Soviets. So then, we go on to the assassination plot if you want to catch us up.
So this one gets a little funkier. Sidney Gottlieb, who was the CIA, he did some of the CIA's mind control experiments in the 1950s, but
Lead chemist for the CIA. Yeah.
that's
Mhm.
right. Lead chemist for the CIA, or the chief poisoner in chief, I think, is what perhaps Stephen Kinzer, I believe, called him. But he apparently was dispatched to the Congo with a poison. However, and this is just probably, I guess, optimal for the CIA. Rather than the CIA killing him, he was killed by Congolese. So that makes it a little bit better when allies or insurgents in your own country do the dirty work for you. But the CIA got, I guess, closer than Castro that time, or at least as far as we know.
Yeah, yeah, right. I do know more about that, but we have a podcast episode coming out about that at the International Spy Museum. So I'll just keep my mouth shut on that one. But we also have a third one that you described, and that is Trujillo.
Yes.
What was the plot and why?
Details of the plot murky, but as far as the what actually happened, it's kind of like Lumumba. He got killed by his own people in the Dominican Republic, and again, it's the same issue as far as the Monroe Doctrine brought into the 20th century. Um, we don't want foreign powers or people who are leaning towards foreign powers, and in this case, it was the Soviet Union during the Cold War, in charge of these countries. And so again, this was again kind of like the Fidel Castro plot. It never actually went through. That's kind of like the big theme of these CIA plots in the 1960s is they were only plots. They were administratively, I would say, sanctioned in the sense of, we need you to come up with an option, which is still very different than actually acting on the option itself.
Hmm. And was this any different than what the Soviets were up to? Or say, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we should talk about the Cubans or the Chinese, but how unusual was it that the agency was thinking about taking out these leaders?
Well, the Soviets did engage in targeted killing of dissidents, certainly. But again, that's different than killing leaders. States tend to be more hands off when it comes to not only killing foreign leaders, but also leaders that are allied with your main adversaries, precisely because of the precedent it sets, and it also risks larger war. Instead, it's much what you see happening more frequently during the Cold War is targeted killing of either your own people, spies who go to the other side, dissidents, or just, in terms of, I guess, that low threshold gray zone conflict, targeted killing of petty leaders, I guess you'd call them, like insurrectionists, guerrilla leaders.
And was the CIA plotting to kill or killing people who weren't leaders at this time? I mean, maybe that sounds like a weird question to be asking, but how far did the lethal targeting go?
Well, that's a better question in the sense of, what do you consider to be targeted killing? The CIA certainly did assist in recruit, train, and advise, kind of like military special operations and proxy forces that were engaged in the same kind of OSS stuff, where it would be sabotage that resulted in the loss of human life. This is true in Angola. It's true in Nicaragua. Um, I mean, I guess you could say to some extent, CIA's operations to supply the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, it resulted in Soviet deaths. That's still qualitatively different, though, I think, than targeted killing, where we have the idea in our head of like someone behind a rifle scope actually shooting someone, or, we'd already talked about it being exploding cigar or sabotage and killing through that.
Right. So then these Senate hearings happen and it becomes exposed that there were these conversations, there were these plots that didn't end up being carried through for one reason or another. So, what kind of response did it get, and what did it change, if anything?
Uh, Great question, because it did have legal outcomes. So by the way, there's a famous picture of Frank Church holding a dart gun up, which I encourage people to look at. You can find it online. But one of the outcomes was an executive order that is famously called, we talk about in intelligence circles as 12333, signed by the Reagan administration, but it banned assassination. Originally, the ban was on political assassination. And I think the spirit of that is like foreign leaders, but then we sort of broadened it to ban assassination. The problem with that, and this is why, kind of the conversation's already off to a funny start when we talk about targeted killing, because there's sort of this debate of how do you differentiate between targeted killing and assassination. Targeted killing is allowed, assassination isn't. So what's actually the line between the two?
Yeah, and it's like the conversation around what's clandestine and what's covert action. These are different. There's differences between them. Clandestine is secret to the point of, if it gets found out that we've been here gathering intel, maybe we get kicked out, the persona non grata. But covert action has different stakes and it is much more secret. So yeah, there are distinctions in the terminology here. And as a person who doesn't often cover this side of things, I might be misusing some words here. So just be aware, people. I'm not an expert on targeted assassinations or killings.
Ha,
It's
you're
not,
using both
it's
there.
not
Now
my
you're saying,
fault. I
well, now you're
know.
saying targeted
Now I'm
assassination.
messing it up even
Yeah.
more, but
No,
okay.
no, no, not at
So,
all.
so now there's some legalities to all of this, which
Mhm.
fast forward to 2025 messes up my day. But we also see that there still are these attempts on leaders' wives. Like there's the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in the 80s. There was Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia. Then, of course, there was Saddam Hussein of Iraq. So, what really changed?
Well, again, there's sort of this. I think General Mattis is the one who said, be nice to everyone, but have a plan to like kill them in your head. It's apocryphally attributed to Mattis, I believe.
I'll
You
keep
know, the,
that in mind next time you come to DC, that while you're being nice to me, but go on.
oh, me, yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's again, the whole purpose of having an intelligence organization that has this kind of like direct or kinetic component is to have a plan. Um, Whether you implement it or not is totally different. Now, because think about it this way too, the intelligence that you would use to even get close to that person in and of itself is valuable enough. But in the event of like a war or major conflict, or if you know that the person poses an imminent threat to the United States, that's important because that comes into play during targeted killing during the global war on terror is the imminence of the threat. You don't want to get caught flat-footed. Um, and certainly when it came to Saddam Hussein, the Iraqis made an attempt on President George H.W. Bush's life. And so, I think having the ability to respond in kind is sort of its own sort of deterrent.
Hmm. Okay. So, you had mentioned the global war on terror. And that's where, at least from the outside, it seems that things really changed. Because that's when we begin to learn about this drone program that was authorized under President Obama. And that brings us to a very specific case that is controversial. Anwar al-Awlaki. He was a U.S. U.S. citizen of Yemeni descent. He was a cleric who joined Al Qaeda and was connected to several terrorist plots. And the United States killed him in Yemen in that was September of 2011.
That's right.
So he did not, uh, he didn't. There was no judicial process. And this was the first time that we know of that a U.S. citizen was killed by the government without due process. So tell me more about that case, the significance of it, and your thoughts on it.
So as a law school graduate, I was fascinated and still am with the Al-Awlaki targeted killing. There it is again. In the past, when you look at instances in which the U.S. has killed U.S. citizens, it's been indirect combat. So, for instance, a U.S. citizen of German descent who goes and fights for the Germans and is killed in combat. That's different. We've also had instances, where we had to legislate the killing of U.S. citizens who committed things like acts of treason or um, were caught as saboteurs. That's still different than what happened with Al-Awlaki because there was an intelligence lead up to find him. A drone is launched that's armed, and then he's basically blown the kingdom come from the sky. So everything about it is targeting this person.
And
You know,
and they killed his son after that as well.
that was incidental, though. So there's a difference also that I want to emphasize where Al-Awlaki was the target. There have been other U.S. citizens who were killed during the global war on terror as part of targeted drone strikes, but they weren't the targets themselves. They were sort of collateral damage, I guess you'd call it. Al-Awlaki was the actual target. And to do
He had been
that,
on a secret list.
that's part of it, is that he was on there was something called Targeting Tuesdays, where the president himself, President Obama, would preside over it. And, the intelligence community would present this person's a threat, these are the capabilities, and then there'd be an approval process. The idea is, and I did all the legal reading, so your viewers don't have to. A case was brought by Al-Awlaki's father to the D.C. District Court before he was killed, and it was challenging his place, his position on this targeted kill list. The problem is the government doesn't deny the exist. They're not going to say, "Yeah, we have a targeted killing list for covert action. Here it is."
Right. So
So,
okay, pausing you for a second here
yep,
because I didn't do this reading and um I wasn't covering this in 2011. What the hell was I doing with my life? Something dumb.
me
Um
too.
so did so how did his father become aware that his son was on this list? Right now we're talking about which cartels are on this new secret list. So how did his dad know?
Well, the Obama administration and senior officials, including, for instance, Attorney General Eric Holder, made statements. Obama, it's interesting. He took a personal interest, especially in Al-Awlaki. There's a quote attributed to him uh, by journalists who documented, the sequence of events, where he said, like, "I want Al-Awlaki, stay after him." This is an order sort of from President Obama. And so there were public pronouncements that, he was on we were targeting him. What the nature of that targeting was is kind of like self evident because we were using drones and killing people. The issue is, again, the fact that he was a US citizen. That's what made it especially contentious, and that's why his dad was able to bring the case to court and say, he's denied due process.
Hold on for 1 second. I gotta go turn on a speaker that's making this sound terrible. So you give me 1 second. Right.
All right.
The joys of Bluetooth. All right.
So this is the issue.
Okay. Mhm.
A couple things. First of all, this is an interesting constitutional argument because I've never really seen it presented this way. But basically, the Obama administration argued, government attorneys argued, well, we reviewed it. We, the executive branch, reviewed it, and so that's due process. Due process doesn't necessarily mean judicial due process. However, for Supreme Court cases in the past, it absolutely meant judicial due process. And not only that, but since the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of the US Constitution, you would think something as important as the Bill of Rights and depriving a citizen of life would require judicial due process. The other interesting thing is that the court itself, when it reviewed the case, said that it's kind of difficult to wrap your mind around that the government needs a warrant, a FISA warrant. So FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, requires a warrant if a U.S. citizen is going to be surveilled through electronic surveillance. But there was no kind of similar requirement to put a U.S. citizen on a kill list. But at the same time, the court that got rid of the case said, this is, and I don't want to get into the legalese of it, but it's a political question, meaning this is something for the president to decide. A court can't determine whether a U.S. citizen is an enemy of the United States. And the final piece for the sake of your viewers, and this is an Intel-oriented channel, what I found especially from an Intel standpoint interesting, but from a constitutionalist standpoint concerning, is that so much of the Barack Obama's administration, their case resided on secret intelligence. They kept saying al-Awlaki is a member of Al-Qaeda. They didn't prove it per se. Now, he himself was, but they said it wasn't just that he was a member, he was an operational leader. So it wasn't just his rhetoric where he did say, kill Americans and all kinds of heinous things that we don't want people like that saying. But to prove he was an operational leader and an imminent threat, that was part of the logic behind killing him. And the case kind of relied on secret intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so let's pull out 2 moments from that response from you. Number one, fascinating to think that there would be protections for Americans and when it comes to surveillance, but there is this loophole that you describe on a targeted kill list. But then also it kind of takes us to this moment. I mean, what we know and don't know about the people in these alleged drug boats. I mean, what kind of precedent did that set that leads us to this moment today? Because remember that when that first drug boat, when he first made light of that on Truth Social, I think there was video footage that we saw, but we didn't have any context. We don't know much about what that really showed. And then he said that this was self-defense. Then the New York Times reported that the boat actually turned away. So your turn. Have fun.
Well, and that's why, again, you have to be. I wrote about the al-Awlaki thing, and I kind of end with a quote from Julius Caesar, which is interesting because basically what Caesar's saying is, be careful about the precedents you set. During the global war on terror, we set a lot of precedents with targeted killing, and we should talk about what CIA targeted killing means as opposed to the military executing these operations.
Because those fall under different titles. Title 50 for intel, Title 10 for military, and right? I got that right.
Here's the interesting thing.
Oh, but then we can cross over. Yeah.
Right. Well, so here's the interesting thing. So the CIA can't do Title 10 operations. That's military activities. That's their realm. But the military can do Title 50 covert action operations if it is tapped in the finding, if it's written, and this is U.S. law that says this, I'll give you all the title in case you want to look it up. Title 53093. Again, I'll do the nerdy stuff so you all don't have to. But it says that it doesn't have to be the CIA. The CIA is the sort of de facto organization for covert action in the US, but the president could say, I want the military to do this. I mean, this is where it gets really complicated because the other thing is you have a prohibition in the laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law on civilians directly participating in hostilities. The CIA is a civilian organization. It's not a military organization. The CIA cannot legally do besides the prohibition on assassination, it can't engage in acts of war directly, like civilians aren't supposed to. This is where the paramilitary side, the covert action side, is a real problematic gray area and sets those kind of troublesome precedents because a civilian agency arguably should not be committing what could be acts of war. Again, this is why I find it, this is where the reporting can be problematic too, is we don't see the finding unless it gets released. I've seen like Reagan era findings. We don't know completely. Remember, these are leaks, and President Trump is saying I signed a finding, but
right. And I just want to jump in for a second.
Yeah.
What this means, it's a presidential finding, which is basically like an authorization for the covert action to be conducted, for just so everybody understands.
That's right. And so that Title 53093, it has to be a written finding. It has to be signed by the president. It can't be what's called retroactive, so it can't be after the action's been taken. It has to be reported as well to the congressional intelligence committees or the Gang of Eight if it's seen as a national security. This would have been reported to the intelligence committees, which means there is congressional oversight of it, by the way. But, again, it could be the military that does these operations. Title 50 authorities, it could be JSOC, for instance, Joint Special Operations Command, which has done covert action as well. So the interesting or the difficulty is remember, we're reading a leak about this that's leaked to journalists, and then the president of the United States is kind of saying, yeah, I signed a finding, but we're not reading the finding. That's where the devil's always in the details.
Right. It's unclear what, who these people are, and what they are accused of. And even, what just all of the details around it. We have heard complaints from members of Congress that they haven't gotten information about this. I guess the Gang of Eight may be read in on it, but Title 50 requires, quote, prior notification to the congressional intelligence committees for each separate activity. The IC, for example, in conducting a covert action, must generally provide prior notification to the congressional intelligence committees by means of a presidential finding describing plans to have an intelligence operation influence political, military, or economic conditions abroad while concealing U.S. sponsorship. And then it goes on to describe how, activities could also, there are exemptions, which include intelligence collection, counterintelligence, law enforcement, and then traditional military activities. But I remember in the early days of this, with Trump coming out and announcing it, we really also got a lot of questions from lawmakers about what this really meant. And Senator Rand Paul has come out very critically of this moment.
Right. Well, and again, this is where it's sort of like the genie's out of the bottle after the global war on terror, because we have to also remember that the designation of cartels as FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations, that opens up more opportunities for the intelligence community and for the military. Traditionally, we were treating drugs as a law enforcement issue, but we more and more in recent years have treated it as an intelligence issue, and now it looks like we're treating it more as a military issue as well. And so
there's also the terminology. Now we hear narco-terrorist as a common term to describe the people who are on these boats.
And well, the thing is, in terms of narco-terrorism, we probably should have been using that terminology sooner because of the alignment in some cases of actual terrorist groups with narcotics. The Taliban dealt in heroin. Hezbollah is known to operate in Central or South America and be affiliated with cartels. So there is a nexus. Like narco terrorism is not, uh, a neologism, a new term. Like this is a problem that the U.S. has just not confronted in the same way or as overtly, which is ironic because it's a covert action finding. So now it's very overt. But I do want to also mention, this is where we're stretching that idea, and why I mentioned the al-Awlaki. You mentioned the al-Awlaki killing, and I sort of said there's some interesting bits here, but the idea of the imminence of the threat. And it seems like what the government is saying, or the administration's position is, you're defending the United States because if they are carrying drugs, and we know these drugs kill tens of thousands of Americans a year, then it's an imminent threat of death to American citizens. And so, people are uncomfortable, I guess, perhaps, with the imminency issue of the threat here. The idea is, well, if someone does a drug and dies, like, should that be like a military issue or something? But, this administration's taking, I guess, some of the precedents that were set during GWOT, and then trying to analogize them, which is what lawyers do, by the way. I do need to stress this will have undergone review by the Office of Legal Counsel. Like this is reviewed by the White House. It's reviewed by the Department of Justice. There are lawyers, just like behind al-Awlaki. There were legal briefs written of why you can do this. There's going to be legal arguments written about why this is okay under U.S. law.
Right. I mean, if you talk about the counsel for any of these intel agencies, they spend time looking at the legality, and sometimes they also have to find justification. They sort of need to thread the loophole to try to create something that an administration wants. And
Yep.
I mean, but we have so few details to know really if this decision is about national security and protecting Americans. I mean, there was conversation regarding the earlier drug boats on the size of the boat and how many people were in the boat. And
Right.
why would there be that many people if you're trying to bring across a certain weight in drugs to try to maximize your profits? And I mean, what about the fact that we now have two survivors
Mm.
who have uh, created a new dynamic? Now we actually have witnesses who are not working for the U.S. government
Mhm.
and who will, as announced, go back to Colombia and Ecuador. They're not Venezuelan,
Mhm.
which is also a little bit confusing to think about. And then another piece to this is that there was a break in the intelligence community around whether or not Venezuela under Maduro was tasking Tren de Aragua to do bad things in the United States. And when the National Intelligence Council said that that was not the case, they lost their jobs. And this administration continues to say that this is a justification for our activity here in the United States, even. So there's just so many pieces to try to make sense of here.
No, there are, and again, that's why you have to be careful of the precedents you set, because there are ways to analogize this to global war on terror, and I wouldn't be surprised. And to some extent, I read a piece on what happens if a U.S. citizen is killed. I think that actually would be less complicated than the al-Awlaki case, unless we deliberately struck a U.S. citizen, in which case it's very similar. And hopefully it would go to the Supreme Court finally for them to legislate.
Because there would be a
Or-
difference of intentional versus accidental.
That's right, exactly. Because they said, what if a U.S. citizen is unintentionally killed? Well, you shouldn't have been unintentionally on a boat with drugs and knowing that you could get killed. But that was kind of the argument made about al-Awlaki. You probably shouldn't join a terrorist group and do things that are terrorist adjacent. But going back to what you were saying as far as disagreements and lawyers, the administration is allowed to disagree with the intelligence community and the National Intelligence Council. That being said, the other thing that we're looking at where this is related to terrorism is sort of the diffuseness of the threat, meaning it's not just one cartel. It's, the administration seems to be taking a hard line, particularly on Venezuela, but also on cartels in general and drugs in general. And then you look at how the global war on terror, if you read some of the earliest um, documents about it. And for instance, the authorization from use of military force against Al Qaeda, it was against Al Qaeda and those responsible for 9/11, but it became the global war on terror. Well, we've had a war on drugs for decades now, but now what you're seeing is a sort of more overt, hotter war on drugs, where a lot of the same logic applies. There's a lot of different cartels. Drugs are killing Americans. The directness of the threat, we sort of feel it more indirectly than terrorism, but it's still a threat to the U.S. It's definitely a national security interest. Um, so, it's
Well,
it's
okay.
interesting to
So,
watch it happen.
well, when we're talking about the global war on terror and the drone program, are we going to see the drone strikes? And will we only see them in the Caribbean, or will we start to see them in Mexico, where some of these cartels are operating? And we spend a lot of time thinking about border security in the South now.
That's right. And so, to the extent that we know, in recent years, and I believe it was at least under the Biden administration or under Burns, the CIA started operating drones over Mexico for collection purposes. It's possible that it could have happened sooner. Again, this is kind of why, this is the murky world of intelligence. But, as far as collecting and using drones for collection, well, we did that in early GWAT too. And then someone figured out, like, let's strap bombs on these things and then we can not only collect, but we can execute. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see the expansion of drone strikes. Right now it's on boats. Who knows? It could be like a sample for public polling purposes. Politicians are intimately concerned with public polling over what they do. Um, it could be testing case for the intelligence itself. But it also could be a matter of trying to signal different countries, like, if you don't get a handle on this, we're going to act unilaterally and we'll start acting within your borders. And this is where the covert action authority is important, because we can implausibly deny that it's us. I mean, that's the idea, implausible deniability. We did drone strikes in Pakistan for years. So it might come down to whether countries prove, whether they're willing and able, or are they unwilling or unable to do these strikes, in which case drones become, as they were during the global war on terror, a useful and also preferred instrument.
I mean, I guess one of the key differences between Venezuela and Mexico is that we do not have a friendly relationship with the Maduro regime. And Claudia Sheinbaum, the leader of Mexico, uh, works with the United States. They collaborate on some of this. And as Brian Naranjo, who I interviewed a couple weeks ago here, had told me, Sheinbaum is trying to make the administration happy by giving them the lowest hanging fruit. So anybody who they can get their hands on from Sinaloa or some of these other cartels, they are giving them over to the United States. Then the US gets to say, we arrested so and so, and it becomes a win for the United States. So it certainly would be taking a different step by then conducting a lethal drone strike on a cartel uh, member in Mexico versus what we're seeing with Venezuela and with these boats.
No, that's true. And, the other thing to keep an eye out for is, so on the one hand, do we see drone strikes start to proliferate against cartels in Central and South America? Or do we see the expansion of targeting Venezuela specifically, which is sort of, what a lot of people are looking at is, you're kind of seeing the drumbeat of the war drums beat around what are we going to do to try and change the regime in Venezuela. And so, or we might see both. But either way, for what we're seeing right now, and the covert action finding could eventually be, provide me options to change the regime in Venezuela. That kind of is like the general guidance, and then you come up with your different options, and you don't necessarily use them, but you have them. So, it will be interesting to see where things head. It probably will go one of those two directions, or maybe both: more drone strikes against cartels, or more direct and probably more escalatory action against Venezuela, which could involve military action.
Right. And we have seen the buildup of both the United States in terms of warships and troops, as well as the Venezuelans. And Maduro has used it as a, a prop in his own propaganda to justify what he does in his own country. So there already is escalation regardless of what it leads to right now.
That's right, and, I should also mention, when you compare Venezuela or Mexico, either way, even allies don't like sovereignty being breached. I mean, so even if someone's working with you under the table, like Pakistan during drone strikes, working with US under the table, but every time, you scream bloody murder about it, even though you were sort of assisting it or allowing it to happen or abetting it or even had drone bases, because you just don't like the breaches of sovereignty. And so then, covert action and the finding itself, again, it's not even plausible deniability, it's implausible deniability, but it gives you just enough leeway for if you're the leader of that country to say, well, this is horrendous. How could the US do this? And the US says, well, it wasn't us, even though it's very clear it was us. So, for everyone watching, you're kind of like sitting here like, well, what's the point of covert action then? It still has utility, and it gives you escape routes, and it gives you policy options if you're the president.
I think that we also saw that this administration and John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, have expressed that they want the CIA to be more bold, pushing away from the dependence on analytics and leaning more into operations. So, part of what we're seeing with the Special Activities Division is very much involved in making that happen. Um, I wanted to make another point now, and I kind of lost on me. So, if you want to sort of reflect on that for a second.
What you just said is very, very, very important when it comes to the intelligence community and the CIA. I've had this conversation more and more in recent days, which is, so what do we want the CIA to do? We started with the OSS, and just so everyone understands, like the OSS was kind of like the one-stop shop for all things intel: collection, analysis, covert action, counterintelligence, propaganda operations, you name it, they tried to do it. Do you really want, or can one organization do all of that? Well, if you ask the CIA, they'll say sure, but that's kind of like, you know, the self-congratulatory answer. The problem is that as the OSS and then as the CIA, we've always seen, and even at the time, OSS officers were saying, you can't combine operations and analysis. It's not objective, or it's not a good idea. You have to focus on one or the other. Well, when we created the Director of National Intelligence in 2004, the Director of National Intelligence became the Chief Intelligence Advisor to the President, the hub through which, all source intelligence analysis and that analytical judgment was supposed to flow to the president. And the ODNI also lay claim to the PDB, the President's Daily Brief. So the CIA and the Director of Analysis still provides the brunt of that intellectual power to the ODNI. The problem is now you have dual hats and competing organizations and figureheads. And so what do you want the CIA to do? Like, do you still want it to be this all source analysis hub and do operations, both clandestine collection and covert action? Or do you want the CIA to sort of do you want to start to pull that analytical function more towards the DNI and have the CIA act more operationally, especially in a world in which, everyone's talking about covert action and secret statecraft and what the Chinese and the Russians are doing? And so this is part of an identity crisis that's been with the CIA since it's created, but it's one that it's about darn time we figure out what we want. And if you're the president, for instance, what do you want your CIA to do? Because the CIA sees itself as directly and intimately related to, we work for the president of the United States. And, they even was a fight about whether the DCIA reports to the DNI or the president. And, oh, by the way, I just will leave this for everyone because we talked about covert action. When they created the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act that creates the DNI, they changed the terms of the covert action. The language for it in the old 1947 National Security Act that said that the CIA would perform such other functions and duties as the NSC, the National Security Council, may from time to time direct. That was code for covert action. The new legislation in 2004, the IRCPA, says such other functions and duties as the president or DNI may from time to time direct. So, in other words, now you have kind of like split covert action authorities. Is it the DNI who does it or the president? The president signs the finding, but if you're the CIA, how responsive are you going to be to the president operationally rather than analytically? This is a big debate going on within the agency and the intelligence community now.
I appreciate you bringing that up. It's certainly interesting to learn more about the intricacies of how all of this works. Another aspect of this that I am thinking about right now is what Russia and China are gathering from what the president has authorized here. Because Venezuela is a unique country, not only in the fact that it has pushed migration and crime into the South American continent. And as the president here says, some crime here into the United States. It also is under the influence of Russia and China, according to South American intelligence experts. So, there's so much evidence of China pushing chemicals into Mexico to feed the fentanyl sicken Americans. This is an intelligence community concern. And when I think about what's happening in Venezuela, I really wonder what Putin and Xi Jinping are thinking right now.
Well, this is where it kind of is like a Cold War redux, but not exactly. Times change. Look, if you have a country that's adversarial to the U.S., then you can probably bet that other bigger, stronger, more capable adversaries are going to look for ways to use that country, to harass and undermine you. And that was again, I alluded to it earlier, the Monroe Doctrine, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Well, during the Cold War, we were very concerned with communist leaders in the Western Hemisphere. Today we're very concerned with inroads that especially China's made economically, but also intelligence activities. And just, in terms of great power competition, you already said it, Sasha, and it's exactly right. There is a concern that China is looking, it's kind of like death by a thousand cuts, looking for ways to corrupt or enervate or hurt the US, and one of those is this drug crisis issue. And so I think that's where, again, there's a certain degree of salesmanship if you're a presidential administration on your policies. And so part of the salesmanship for this is that drugs are killing Americans. It's not just cartels. There's sinister actors that are behind it. And by the way, are you really happy with China and Russia and agents of influence and their operations on our doorstep? That's really where it gets for Americans who are used to these two big oceans and problems generally stay over there. Once you start pulling those pieces together, you know, this is a big national security problem. And so even if people don't like how the Trump administration is handling it, I think in some ways, by doing the things they have, it's gained far more attention, perhaps too later than it should have, for an issue that we probably should have paid more attention to for decades, but we were fighting the global war on terror.
But an age-old problem that we have seen in the intelligence community is that national security always bumps up against human rights, whether we're talking about people's lives, surveillance, and here we are having this conversation again without having the details of who these people actually are. The question is, what did they deserve? Did they deserve to be investigated, to have some kind of extradition and trial, or, like, or screw them, nuke them? I mean, like, who
We have
knows?
we have parallels from the global war on terror there. One of the reasons the Obama administration went to targeted killing, and when you look at the targeted killing via drones from the Bush administration, it goes like this with the Obama administration. One of the reasons why is the Obama administration trapped itself from a policy angle. President Obama campaigned against extraordinary rendition. That's where we seize terrorists and put them in prisons in countries where they do the torturing or we did enhanced interrogations. But we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to bring them here and try them and put them in U.S. prisons. So what do? Well, you kill them. In other words, you kind of can trap yourself from a policy angle. And then there's a capabilities angle too, which is the Coast Guard, who would do drug interdictions, clearly isn't. I mean, drugs are getting through. Like, I think everyone, I'm not saying anything anyone doesn't know. We have a porous border problem when it comes to drugs, whether it's overland or by sea. So, from a capabilities standpoint, how do you stop it? That's a real policy question. Do you deploy the US Navy? I mean, the Navy has a lot of issues already. We also have, a blue water Navy. The Coast Guard requires more than assets than it has to do these operations sufficiently and often enough and pursue these boats. A Coast Guard cutter can't chase down these fast boats. They need helicopters. So what do we have more of and what have we been doing well for 20 something years? Well, we got drones that just kind of loiter and you put a missile on them and all of a sudden a little boat pops up. And oh, from the deterrent aspect, you know, it didn't obviously deter terrorism and some problems you'll never completely solve, but maybe someone's like, well, I don't think I'm going to jump on that X boat to help deliver drugs to the US because I saw what happened to the last boat. So, I mean, this is a complex game of we're trying to assemble policy pieces. And certainly what it looks like the Trump administration's doing is they're like, hey, this worked for global war on terror. It took something from a very unmanageable and unacceptable level down to a manageable and acceptable level. Let's try the same thing with drugs.
Yeah, I guess the question is, what's the path in weakening these cartels? These are sophisticated operations. Do they start investing in actual submarines that go so deep that it would require more intelligence from the United States to monitor and target them? Uh,
There's that's the ebb and flow of measure and countermeasure. Like I said, terrorism's still a problem. It it doesn't look to be, or at least the type of problem that we first encountered when it came to Al Qaeda, and then certainly with ISIS. We did a lot to manage that problem. That's again what policy is. It's problem management. You're not problem solving. You're problem managing. So we drugs has been an unmanageable, unacceptable problem in this country for a very long time. I think you see a much more, and this is, by the way, in the national security strategy of the United States, like this is a big priority for this administration. Other administrations talked about it. We had Reagan and the war on drugs, but this administration is making counter narcotics a serious foreign policy priority. That's something different than what we've really seen. And so, but when you look at again applying different methods, what we seem to be seeing is sort of this march towards applying global war on terrorism type methods to the drug problem.
I also am so interested in understanding what the Trump administration's calculation was on what the appetite would be for Americans to learn about this. Was there a thought that Americans would be permissive of this behavior? And what does that lead to? I don't know.
Well, one thing that is, in the past at least, public polling has been pretty clear about controlling immigration problems, the drug problem in this country. Drug deaths touch a lot more Americans than I think people might realize. Um, it's hollowed out cities in the Rust Belt. When the average life expectancy for a male is like approaching like Russian levels, like 40 years old or something, and a big cause is addiction and opioids and drug deaths. I mean, this is a public health issue, but it's also a national security issue. And so, you know, I think what we're seeing, and especially, in with the sort of the way that the press is putting it is like shoot the messenger. In other words, it's the Trump administration that's doing this. But I think the American appetite for fixing our own house, as opposed to looking so far abroad, it's now sort of coming closer. And it's like, yeah, well, drugs are a big issue and immigration's a problem. And cartels are responsible for both drugs and immigration issues in the United States. So there is public appetite, at least by polling to some extent, for addressing these national interests.
Yeah, but do we have polling on shooting or bombing these boats? I don't know.
That's so I will say this is during the global war on terror there was a lot of polling done, and basically the sentiment generally, and it's not always like a 90-10, it's sometimes like a 50-50 or 60-40, but generally over the majority when it comes to hey, do you want us to stop terrorists? I know that's a very open-ended thing, but it's like yes. So do you want us to stop cartels? Polling would probably say yes. Then when you get into the nitty-gritty details of how, you got to be careful. I don't know if you've seen Napoleon Dynamite. I like to allude to it for the viewers who have, watch it. But Rex Kwon Do, where it's like, grab my hand, not that hand, the other hand. No, with your hand. Like, how nitty-gritty do the American people want to get into policymaking? And I think I need to bring that full circle back to covert action. So one of the interesting things about covert action debates during the committee's hearings was Congress thought after the committee hearings that it would legislate covert action. And what I mean by that is legislate with specificity. You can do this, you can't do that. By the mid to late 80s and then the 90s, Congress gave up. And they did legislate that covert action piece I told you about, 3093. It was formerly 413 and 413B in the early 90s. So they spent the entire Cold War talking about covert action and how to legislate it. And they only gave it a definition and legislated it in the early 90s, 91. But the issue was they decided, no, you know what? This thing needs to be flexible. And so one of the things that you just made me think of is, do we need to poll the American people about every type of operation in every place? Because I can also tell you as an historian, it doesn't work. One more piece on this because it just came to mind. During the 80s, there was a lot of covert action that was exposed. Ronald Reagan, kind of like people are saying, well, Trump just said he signed a finding. Ronald Reagan inadvertently, perhaps, mentioned that he had authorized covert action. I believe it was in Angola in a public Q&A with the press. And people are like, oh, he spilled the beans. The issue was there was a lot of covert action going on. A lot of it was being reported. But when you look at what the American people supported and didn't support, we weren't reliable. We supported covert action against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, but we didn't support covert action against communists in Angola, even though there were communists and Cubans there. We didn't support covert action in Nicaragua. So, how do you can't public poll. I mean, I'm saying this as a constitutionalist who believes in democracy. You can't public poll your way through foreign policy because you'll never get anything done. Because
Right.
it'll be Rex Kwon-Do. Well, you can do this here, but not there, but not like that, like the way I want you to do it. And so
Right.
that's part of the difficulty with this.
Right. So basically, this is the information, but how does this lesson get applied and to where? So, as a last question for you, and thank you for joining, Jeff, what are you going to be looking at when it comes to these drug boats and activity in Venezuela moving forward so that the people who are watching this video live and people who will be watching it later can think about that and maybe watch it themselves?
I suppose the first thing is I'm not surprised. The second thing is I'm not convinced it's going to work. Again, we didn't solve the problem of terrorism with drone strikes, but we certainly, made it a lot harder to do and more. We took again an unmanageable, unacceptable problem and made it more manageable, more acceptable. I think we're at the beginning of this. I see it expanding rather than contracting. It is possible that there will be, an unintended strike that kills an American citizen, or we find out that someone, is a dual citizen or something, or like Al-Awlaki is born in the U.S. and goes somewhere else. But what I guess I'm more interested in seeing is how this expands in Venezuela, particularly. And we talked about this, Mexico and Venezuela. Mexico, I don't think we'd see like, U.S. military boots on the ground, but we might at some point see a drone strike. Venezuela, the question is this going to transition from drones to more aggressive covert action within Venezuela, and then possibly even military action? Because sometimes covert action is the tip of the spear, but then you need the rest of the spear. The tips, like you need more than that, and so the military provides that force.
Hmm. Well, I'm so grateful for your time and this conversation. For everybody who is joining us, you can check out Jeff's recent book, The Spy and the State: The History of American Intelligence, that came out, what was this, last year, this year?
Just in June with Oxford
Okay, yeah.
University
What
Press.
what is time anymore? Okay, so it's
It's relative.
basically fresh off the press. Check out the book, and you can also follow him on LinkedIn and other places. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. That really, really helps me to keep doing this work. And I'll see you guys again soon. And Jeff, hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks. I'd love to be on again with you, Sasha.
All right. Bye for now.